March 9th, 2026, 2:34 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. While most Americans were sleeping, just hours before Congress was set to meet for an emergency session to override President Trump's policies, the Bank of Canada executed the most aggressive currency intervention in modern central banking history. Financial analysts were stunned. Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Mlam, acting on direct orders from Prime Minister Mark Carney's office, announced that Canada is rolling out a multi-pronged financial strategy designed to weaponize the Canadian dollar against U.S. economic interests. This is no ordinary move. The strategy included 3 simultaneous actions, all of which are sending shockwaves through global financial markets. First, Canada is pegging the Canadian dollar to a basket of currencies, including the euro, British pound, Japanese yen, and Chinese yuan, effectively severing its long-standing tie with the US dollar. Second, Canada is requiring that all Canadian energy exports, when they resume, be paid in Canadian dollars, euros, or yuan, explicitly banning US dollars. Third, Canada is working with 40 countries in the Democratic Trade Alliance to establish the Canadian dollar as a reserve currency for international trade. This is warfare. This is Canada attacking the very foundation that has kept the US dollar as the world's reserve currency for 80 years, and it's happening now, at 2:34 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Why? Because Carney wanted these measures in place before US markets could react, and before Congress could potentially pass override legislation that might complicate Canada's strategy. Trump woke up to a world where the Canadian dollar is no longer just another currency. It's a weapon. I'll break this down for you. Here's what Canada's strategy means and how it threatens the US dollar's reserve status. I'll show you the immediate reaction in Asian and European markets, which opened hours before US markets. I'll explain why requiring payments in Canadian dollars for energy exports will devastate US buyers and US dollar demand. I'll reveal how the Democratic Trade Alliance is backing Canada's currency strategy. And I'll give you 3 scenarios for what will happen when US markets open in just a few hours. Let's start with the 3 parts of Canada's currency strategy. Each one is designed to undermine a different aspect of US dollar dominance. First, the currency basket peg. Historically, the Canadian dollar floated freely, but it correlated closely with the US dollar due to the massive trade volume between the 2 countries. When the US dollar strengthened, the Canadian dollar typically strengthened. When the US dollar weakened, the Canadian dollar typically weakened. But now, Canada is breaking that correlation. Starting this morning, the Canadian dollar will be pegged to a basket of currencies: 30% euro, 25% British pound, 20% Japanese yen, 15% Chinese yuan, and 10% Swiss franc. Notice what's missing: 0% US dollar. This means the Canadian dollar will now move based on European, British, Japanese, and Chinese economic conditions, not US conditions. If the US dollar crashes due to the ongoing crisis, the Canadian dollar won't crash with it. Instead, it could remain stable or even strengthen based on its peg to other major currencies. This shields Canada from US economic chaos while signaling to global markets that the Canadian dollar is no longer tied to the US economy. Second, mandatory Canadian dollar payments for energy. Since the 1970s, the petrodollar system has been in place, where oil is priced and traded in US dollars. The world has needed US dollars to buy oil. This has created constant demand for US dollars and allowed the US to run massive deficits without the dollar collapsing. But Canada just broke that system. Now, if US buyers want Canadian energy, they'll have to use Canadian dollars, euros, or yuan. What does this mean for the US? First, US buyers will now need to sell dollars to buy Canadian dollars. This will put downward pressure on the US dollar. Second, it reduces global demand for US dollars since energy can now be bought with other currencies. Third, it establishes a precedent that major energy exporters don't have to accept US dollars. Other producers like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or Russia could follow Canada's lead. If the petrodollar system collapses, US dollar demand collapses, and its reserve currency status becomes unsustainable. Third, Democratic Trade Alliance reserve currency coordination. Canada has announced that 40 countries in the Democratic Trade Alliance will hold Canadian dollars as part of their official foreign exchange reserves and will use the Canadian dollar for trade settlements. Do you realize the significance? $58 trillion of annual economic activity will now flow through the Canadian dollar instead of the US dollar. This increases demand for the Canadian dollar while reducing the demand for the US dollar. By 6 a.m., markets had already reacted. Asian markets saw massive movement, with the US dollar weakening against the yen, yuan, and Singapore dollar. The Canadian dollar surged 6.8% against the US dollar in Asian trading, the highest it's been since 2011. In Europe, the reaction was just as strong. The US dollar weakened 4.1% against the euro and 3.8% against the British pound. The European Central Bank even issued a statement endorsing Canada's move, saying it welcomed a diversification of global reserve currencies. In Washington, by 3:15 a.m., the Treasury Secretary was briefed on the situation. A conference call with the Federal Reserve and senior Treasury staff was held to discuss how the U.S. could respond to Canada's move. The Federal Reserve warned that intervening could deplete U.S. reserves, and raising interest rates could harm an already struggling economy. The consensus? The U.S. has no good options. Then, by 6 a.m., Mexico joined the movement. President Claudia Sheinbaum announced that Mexico would also require payments for energy exports and manufactured goods to be made in currencies other than U.S. dollars. Now, 3 scenarios for what happens when U.S. markets open tomorrow morning. Scenario 1. Congress overrides Trump's veto. Scenario 2. Override fails, and Canada proceeds with its full strategy. Scenario 3. Trump issues an executive order accepting Canada's demands. The vote happens today. The currency war is happening now. The outcome will determine if the US dollar remains the world's dominant currency or becomes just another currency among many.